Hey Sugar Geeks, Liz here. Today I'm going to be showing you all about how to make a perfectly square buttercream cake. You don't want to miss this. So the first thing we want to do when we're making a square cake is get all of our stuff together. So I have my tools, I have my cakes already baked, they're chilled and ready to go. I've got my turntable to frost everything. I have a cake board here. I've yet to find square cake boards that come in like 6, 8, 10. So if you know where some are, tell me where they are. And we have an offset spatula, a nice tall bench scraper, a knife for trimming our cakes and making them all pretty like, ruler and X-Acto blade. Okay, so let's go ahead and cut our cake board. If you look on the edge of your cake board, the very far edge, it tends to slope down. So if you're like me, you'll cut that part off because I want a nice sharp edge. Funny thing about cake, you think that this is a 6-inch cake. It's actually a little bit less than 6 inches. So I don't make my board any bigger than 6 inches. 6 inches is from here to here. And if I put my cake in that spot, there's already a little bit of room on either side, and I haven't even trimmed my cake yet. So you could do 6 inches, or you could do a 6 1/4 if you wanted extra buttercream, but I only do 6 inches. 6. So if you were, on top of things, you could cut quite a few of these cake boards ahead of time. Save yourself some work. Or you could just avoid square cakes like the plague, like I do. No, you don't want a square cake for your wedding. Voila, my little 6-inch. Okay, so now we're going to trim our cakes. And I'm just putting some plastic wrap down onto my turntable to catch my cake scraps. And I always get comments, oh, don't waste your cake, like you don't have to cut cake off. Like, it's literally just the brown part on the outside of the cake. If you want to use baking strips, Wilton makes these strips that you dip in the water and you wrap around the cake, and it makes them a little bit less brown on the outside. I just don't like taking that extra step. So I just trim my cakes. It's just a very small amount. It's not a big deal. So we're just going to literally take our knife and just come right on the outside and just trim off just that brown part. And what this does, especially with wedding cakes, is when you cut into the cake, it's very nice and white and you don't see any brown lines. So this is my white cake for carving recipe. It's been chilled, so it's nice and easy to handle. Like, it's not crumbly. That's really important when you're first learning to stack cakes is, working with a chilled cake or even a semi-frozen cake is a lot easier than trying to work with a freshly baked cake. I'm gonna place my little board here, and I've got my easy buttercream ready to go. Little dollop. First cake, center it, push it down nice and flat. Now we're gonna place some buttercream. I go with about a 1/4 inch of buttercream between my layers. I'm using my offset spatula and just really focusing on keeping it nice and level so that as I add my next layer of cake, it doesn't have a dome in the center. Next layer of cake. Don't worry about this frosting that's oozing out the sides. That's gonna actually be great for us. Last layer goes on top. I'm just kind of wiggling each layer as I place it on top to just make sure there's no like bubbles and stuff caught in there. Okay, so now all we have to do is just take all this extra buttercream and just kind of give it a nice thin layer. That's called a crumb coat. It seals in the crumbs, and then it also is kind of like the basis for when we chill the cake, so it's nice and firm and stable for the final layer of buttercream, which sounds like, oh, just the final layer. That's it. That's the part that's the hardest. So the more we get things perfect right now, the easier it's gonna be later. Okay, so that's pretty much good for a crumb coat. I'm gonna now place this in the refrigerator, leave it for an hour or so, just until it's totally firmed up and not moving around too much anymore. Okay, our cake is been chilling. So now we're gonna start creating those horrible sharp corners. So I'm gonna take some of my buttercream and I'm just gonna start building up those corners because the middle is always higher than the edges. And because this is like partially frozen, it's really chilled, the buttercream starts setting really quickly. Smooth that out on top, nice and flat. Next, I'm gonna start building up the corners by just taking my buttercream and just building up nice and thick. So typically with a round cake, this would be the last step, is to just put on that final coat of buttercream and scrape off the excess and then you're done. But with a square cake, there's almost like 3 steps. So you put the crumb coat on, chill it, then you put the second to final crumb coat on, and we're gonna scrape it down and get it almost as square as possible, chill it again, and then we'll come in and put some like final things on there. You see how this little corner is sort of rounded? So I'll put like buttercream there and like build up that corner. A square cake also has more servings than a round cake, so you are gonna end up using more buttercream as well. I would say there's probably about 1/3 more buttercream that you're gonna use. So when we're gonna start scraping this buttercream off, you'll see the corners are gonna be ruined. So the way that I develop these corners is I start at the corner here. You can even go beyond it if you need to, and go to about the middle of the square, and then you're gonna come the opposite direction and making sure that you're keeping your bench scraper straight up and down. Go that way. And really, I should be using a different bench scraper than this. So this bench scraper has a little rounded bit handle on it, and this acts as a way to kind of keep your cake level. So if you don't have it, then you can kind of go like this pretty easily. So it's almost like keeping it at a 90-degree angle. So this is like one more tool that you can use to make sure that your cakes are straight up and down. So now I'm just kind of cleaning up the top edge and make it nice and flat. But you see these corners just always want to kind of like be rounded. You don't want to be sharp. I'm going to build up this corner a little bit more. I just don't want to be doing a ton of work at this last pass, so I'm going to try and build up these corners as much as possible first. I'm going to call this good for right now. I'm going to put it back in the fridge. Okay, so now for the final sharp edge of buttercream. I've got my turntable extender here because that goes really well with this turntable and provides a nice wide surface. So the other thing you can do is you can take a large, like 12-inch or 14-inch cake board and put your parchment paper on that with the shortening if you don't have a turntable extender. So I'm just gonna take a little bit of my vegetable shortening and just kind of get the top of this a little bit tacky. We're basically gonna do the upside down technique. So I got the parchment paper on there, and we're gonna take some of our buttercream and just do a real thin layer. Don't need to do a ton because we already have basically our layer of buttercream on top of the cake. Make it nice and big, this is like 10 inches. Then I have my chilled cake here from the freezer, so you should be able to handle it just fine with your hands. And just place that right on top. Give it a little wiggle to make a good connection. No, this will not hurt your cake. So now I can go ahead and just like take this buttercream and just kind of smush it up and just fill in your gaps, build up those corners. So when you put it upside down like this, what this does is it helps you develop those corners that want to become rounded. Otherwise, you just spend so much time going over them and over them and over them, trying to get them sharp, and they just never seem to get sharp. This is totally just a precaution, but I have a little level here that I use when I do the upside down method to just make sure that I'm not totally crooked. But you can just kind of push down on one side to make yourself perfectly level. Scrape off my excess buttercream. And all we have to do is take our bench scraper, hold it nice and level, and just scrape around. I think it's pretty evident already how much cleaner those edges are gonna look. You can do this exact same technique with ganache. If you live in a super hot environment, ganache does not sweat and it stays really firm. So people in Texas or Hawaii, Florida, California, they use ganache quite often instead of buttercream. To do this technique, it does not matter what kind of buttercream you use, so you can use whatever you feel comfortable with. The only thing I wouldn't suggest using is like, whipped cream or cream cheese icing. I mean, that's just making it harder than it needs to be. So now, we have to start getting these little overlaps here. And this is when I'm gonna start coming in with my bench scraper and just really coming in from this side and pulling back towards the center. And then coming from the opposite direction, bringing it right up to that corner, pulling back. So that's pretty sharp right there. So each corner, just continue sharpening it by starting at the corner and pulling back to the middle. If you try to, start at the corner and then go all the way past, you'll end up messing up the other corner. As long as you keep your bench scraper straight up and down, you will have straight edges. Just like resist the urge to, make it tilt. Once you get your corners super duper sharp, I admit it does take some time. That's why I hate doing the square cakes, but it does look really nice. And I've been using a warm bench scraper that I then dry with a towel to get that final smooth coat. And then I'm just gonna put this into the freezer for another 10 minutes or so before we turn it back over. Okay, cake has been chilling. I'm gonna lift my turntable extender up a little bit, put my hand underneath, holding, hand on top, and we're gonna turn it over. And I'm going really slow just so that you can see how easy it is, I promise. I'm gonna set that down on the turntable and then carefully lift up this guy. And then we can pull off the parchment paper and all of that hard work for getting those sharp edges. So there's usually a few little wrinkle marks from the parchment, and I'll just fill those in. And I'm just going to finish that top edge real easy like. I'm not really pressing that hard. I'm just getting that edge of buttercream to go straight back up again. I've got my offset spatula, and then I can just smooth that down. I'm sure that I will get some comments saying that they can do it much better than me and much faster, and that's okay. I will just continue to avoid square cakes like the plague. So that is basically it. Now I have a perfectly square cake. Coming up soon, we're gonna have another video on how to cover a square cake in fondant. So if you're a masochist like me, you wanna continue learning hard things, which I know you do, you're definitely gonna wanna watch that one. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. I'm Liz Merrick, and I'll see you guys next week. Ah! Just kidding.